Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive from the Curious Minds channel. Today, we're really getting into the last 100 years or so of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. It's quite a history. We've drawn on discussions with a historian, a political scientist, to try and bring you a clearer picture. We know you're looking for insights quick but deep, seeing things from different angles, getting those aha moments. So that's our goal today. Unpack this complex story, maybe hit on some surprising facts, just have an engaging conversation about it. And joining me is our expert historian and political scientist. Welcome.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Great. So let's jump right in. One thing that really stood out from our research was this take on the Eisenhower Doctrine. The historian we looked at argued that, well, fighting communism wasn't even the main goal.
Right.
It was supposedly, first, dismantling the British and French empires, second, stopping pan-Arabism, and then fighting communism, like third priority. That feels significant.
It absolutely is. It shifts the perspective, doesn't it?
Totally. So can you break that down? What was going on after World War II that would lead to that kind of thinking?
Well, you have to remember the context. Post-WWII, the U.S. is, the dominant global superpower. The Soviet Union is definitely seen as a rival, sure. But the old European empires, Britain and France, they're fading.
Okay.
So one interpretation, the one this historian puts forward, is that Eisenhower saw an opportunity. It wasn't just about containing the Soviets. It was also about managing the decline of Britain and France, stepping into that power vacuum, and establishing a new American-led global order, a kind of Pax Americana, if you will.
Pax Americana. Replacing the old guard. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But why was pan-Arabism such a big threat? Why rank that potentially higher than communism?
That's a really key question. There were probably several layers to it. First, and maybe most obviously, oil. The Middle East has vast petroleum reserves, a unified Arab bloc controlling that. That's huge leverage, potentially challenging Western economic interests.
Right, the oil. Always the oil.
Always the oil. Second, there's a historical dimension. Sort of underlying anti-Islamic sentiment with roots going way back, even into early American history. The historian mentioned things like efforts to Christianize enslaved people back in the 17th century. It's a long-standing thing.
Interesting historical context.
And third, maybe a geopolitical view. The Middle East has historically been a cradle of empires, a global crossroads for millennia. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed, maybe Western powers didn't want to see a powerful, unified entity rise there again. Keep it divided, easier to manage.
So resources, historical bias, and presenting a regional power from reemerging, it's a lot more complex than just stop the Soviets.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the difference between that interpretation and, say, what you might read on Wikipedia. The official sources usually stress countering Soviet aggression. Our historian called that the official line.
Yeah, and that's understandable, right? The Cold War was the public framework. Stopping communism was the stated policy, the easy explanation.
Makes sense.
But foreign policy often has multiple layers. There's the public justification, and then there are sometimes deeper, maybe less spoken about, strategic goals. Analyzing the actions the U.S. took, not just the words, can reveal those other motivations.
Okay, so let's look at an action. The Suez Canal crisis in 1956. How does that event fit into this idea of undermining Britain and France?
Suez is a perfect case study. So Nasser in Egypt needs funding for the Aswan High Dam. The U.S. and U.K. pull their funding offer, partly because Egypt bought arms from Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
Nasser's response. He nationalizes the Suez Canal, owned mostly by British and French interests, to use the revenue for the dam.
Big move.
Huge. So Britain, France, and Israel secretly coordinate and attack Egypt. Now here's the twist. If the Eisenhower Doctrine's primary goal was weakening Britain and France, well, the U.S. then puts immense pressure on its own allies, Britain, France, Israel, to withdraw.
Even though Nasser was seen as leaning towards the Soviets.
Precisely. The U.S. action effectively humiliated Britain and France on the world stage, accelerated the decline of their empires, and signaled a shift in global power. It fits that interpretation quite neatly, even if it meant, in the short term, Nasser kind of won.
Wow. Sacrificing the short-term anti-Soviet goal for the longer-term goal of replacing European influence.
That's the argument, yeah.
What about 1958, Lebanon and Iraq?
Yeah.
How do those situations show these priorities in action?
Right. 1958 is another key moment. In Lebanon, there's internal conflict. Some factions want to join Nasser's United Arab Republic, the UAR, which was Egypt and Syria briefly unified.
Yep.
The U.S. intervenes in Lebanon. But in Iraq, there's a revolution that overthrows the pro-Western monarchy. The U.S. considers intervening, maybe even invades. But the analysis suggests the main U.S. concern wasn't necessarily who ended up in power in Iraq, monarchists, socialists, whatever, but preventing Iraq from joining Nasser's UAR.
So stopping Arab unity was the priority.
It seems that way. The argument goes that the U.S. might have even preferred, or at least tolerated, communists gaining some influence in Iraq if it meant stopping Iraq from joining this pan-Arab state.
So stopping pan-Arabism trumped fighting communism in that specific instance.
That's the historian's interpretation of the events, yes. And interestingly, the UAR itself fell apart just a few years later anyway when Syria pulled out.
It really complicates the narrative.
Yeah.
So to understand this fear of pan-Arabism, we need to understand the Arab world itself a bit better. Can you give us a quick sketch of Arab identity and how these modern borders came about?
Sure. Arab identity is primarily linguistic and cultural, tracing back to the 7th century and the spread of Islam and the Arabic language. It covers a huge area, from Morocco to Iraq.
Right.
But it's important to remember there's immense diversity within that, genetically, culturally, dialect-wise. It's not monolithic, but the shared identity marker is powerful.
And the borders.
The borders. Largely a post-World War I creation by European powers. Think Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain and France carved up the Ottoman Empire to suit their own interests.
The infamous lines in the sand.
Pretty much. They often ignored existing ethnic or tribal realities, sometimes deliberately dividing groups or lumping rivals together. Classic divide and rule.
Was there an alternative vision coming from the region itself?
Yes, definitely. The historian pointed to things like the 1919 uprising in Egypt, which was pushing for a secular, socialist, pan-Arab state. An indigenous idea, quite different from the borders imposed by Europe.
Okay. Now, earlier you touched on the early Arab conquests. The description used was shockingly non-Muslim and shockingly non-Arab in character initially. What does that mean?
It's a fascinating point. It means the initial expansion wasn't about forcing everyone to become Muslim or speak Arabic immediately. The early rulers often kept existing administrators, local elites, Greek or Persian languages for bureaucracy. Conversion to Islam and the adoption of Arabic happened gradually over centuries.
Why? Practical reasons.
Often, yes. Practical, economic. Like in Egypt, it took centuries for Arabic to become dominant, probably because it was the language of the empire's administration and trade. Same with conversion to Islam. It wasn't usually forced. It happened over a long period for various social and economic reasons. The early empire was much more diverse than we might think.
That really challenges stereotypes. Okay, let's pivot back to the 20th century and a key driver, oil. How did Western powers first get involved in Middle Eastern oil?
Well, oil becomes crucial, especially for Britain and its navy moving from coal to oil. You had early competition between British companies like Royal Dutch Shell and American ones like Standard Oil. Britain was very focused on securing its own source. They found it early on in Persia, modern Iran, around 1908 with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company.
Okay, Anglo-Persian, that name will come up again.
It will indeed. And oil was also found in the Ottoman Empire in what's now northern Iraq. Since the Ottomans were allied with Germany before and during World War I, controlling that oil became a major strategic concern for Britain.
Which leads us right back to Sykes-Picot. How did oil factor into that carving up of the Ottoman Empire?
It was definitely on their minds. The initial Sykes-Picot plan, remember, was cooked up during the war, before the Arab Revolt really took off. Originally, France was supposed to get Syria, Lebanon, and crucially, the Mosul region of Iraq, which had the known oil fields. Britain was slated for Palestine, Jordan, and southern Iraq.
So Britain initially didn't get the Iraqi oil.
Not in the first draft, no. They already had Persian oil. But then the Russian Revolution happened, Russia dropped out of the deal, and things got renegotiated. In the end, Britain managed to secure control over all of Iraq, including Mosul and its oil. France got Syria and Lebanon. France was weaker after WWI, so they likely had less leverage to object.
So Britain ended up with Iraqi oil after all. The lines on the map shifted based on oil and power politics.
Pretty much sums it up.
Okay, now the U.S. starts getting more directly involved post-World War II. Let's talk about the 1949 coup in Syria, backed by the CIA. What was the thinking there? It seems early for major U.S. intervention.
It does seem early, and the rationale isn't crystal clear. Syria wasn't a huge oil player then, nor a massive strategic threat. One theory the historian mentioned was that it might have been something of a CIA experiment, testing the waters, seeing if they could orchestrate regime change.
That experiment, that's unsettling.
It is. And whatever the motive, it certainly destabilized Syria. It kicked off a whole series of coups and political instability there for years afterward.
Okay, fast forward a few years to 1953, Iran. Another CIA-backed coup, this time against Prime Minister Masada. This one seems clear it was about oil, right?
Yes, this one is much more directly tied to oil. Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, formerly Anglo-Persian, remember?
Ah, yes, the same company.
He wanted a fair deal for Iran. Britain was furious. The U.S. was concerned about losing access to Iranian oil and also the Cold War fear that maybe Iran could drift towards the Soviets.
So they intervened.
They did. The CIA, along with British intelligence, orchestrated the coup that removed Mossadegh and brought the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, back to absolute power. It crushed Iran's brief democratic experiment.
And this set up decades of close U.S.-Iran ties under the Shah, but also resentment that boiled over later.
Exactly. The U.S. basically propped up the Shah. He pushed modernization, often Western style, and was a key U.S. ally. But many Iranians saw him as a puppet, resented the authoritarian rule, the suppression of dissent, and what they felt was an erosion of Iranian culture under American influence. This all built up towards the 1979 revolution.
We'll definitely come back to that revolution. But first, let's talk about the other major pillar of U.S. policy in the region, Saudi Arabia. How did that relationship start? The meeting on the USS Quincy in 1945 seems key.
It's foundational. Roosevelt meets King Abdulaziz on the USS Quincy. They strike a deal, often called the Quincy Agreement.
What were the terms, basically?
Pretty straightforward. U.S. gets access to Saudi oil through Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company. Saudis agree to price oil in U.S. dollars, which is huge for the dollar's global status. U.S. gets an airbase in Dhahran.
And what did the Saudis get?
Oil revenue, obviously. But critically, a U.S. commitment to protect the Saudi royal family and the kingdom's security.
Oil for security.
That's the core of it. From the Saudi view, it was maybe a calculated bet. As long as the oil flows and U.S. companies profit, the U.S. has a vested interest in keeping the royal family in power. Later, Saudi investments in the U.S. further solidified this interdependence.
A very pragmatic, long-lasting arrangement. Okay, let's swing back to Egypt and Nasser. We talked about his pan-Arab dream. What happened with the United Arab Republic, the union with Syria? Why did it fail?
Well, Nasser's vision was ambitious, this secular, socialist, unified Arab state, but the actual union with Syria in '58 was rushed. It was partly done to preempt a potential communist takeover in Syria, but it wasn't well planned or managed. There were administrative problems, Syrian resentment of Egyptian dominance.
So it didn't last.
No, it collapsed after just 3 years when the Syrian military staged a coup and pulled out. Then, Egypt got bogged down in a long, costly civil war in Yemen in the early 60s, supporting Republican forces there. That drained resources and attention.
And he also faced internal challenges.
Yes, rising Islamic fundamentalism was a challenge to his secular vision. There's a famous anecdote the historian shared about Nasser mocking a Muslim Brotherhood leader who demanded all women wear headscarves. It highlights that cultural clash.
And all this leads up to the 1967 war.
It does. Tensions were high. There were border clashes, Israeli raids into Jordan. King Hussein of Jordan appealed for help. Nasser felt pressured to act, moved troops into the Sinai, blockaded the Straits of Tiran.
And the result?
A devastating defeat for the Arab armies in just 6 days. Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. It was a shattering blow to Nasser, to Egypt, and to the whole pan-Arab movement. He even offered to resign, though crowds demanded he stay.
A truly pivotal moment. Okay, central to all this is the Palestinian issue. Can you give us the condensed history? How did we get from the early 20th century to the situation after 1948?
It's complex, obviously. Initially, Zionist immigrants arriving in Palestine from Europe were, in some cases, welcomed. But as the movement grew, focused on land acquisition, sometimes legally, sometimes through pressure or confiscation, and as Zionist paramilitary groups became active, tensions soared.
Then came the Holocaust.
Yes, the horrors of the Holocaust created huge international sympathy and a powerful drive for a Jewish state. The irony, the historian noted, is that Palestine was chosen, a land completely unconnected to the events of the Holocaust itself.
And the UN partition plan.
1947, the UN proposed dividing Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem internationalized. Jewish leaders accepted it, Arab leaders rejected it.
Leading to war.
When Israel declared independence in May 1948, neighboring Arab states invaded. Israel won the war, ending up with about 78% of mandatory Palestine. Critically, around 750,000 Palestinians either fled or were expelled from their homes.
The Nakba.
The Nakba, or catastrophe, as Palestinians call it. There were massacres, like Deir Yassin, that contributed to the fear and flight. This created the Palestinian refugee crisis that persists to this day.
A foundational trauma.
Yeah.
Okay, let's return to Iran, 1979. We know why the Shah was unpopular, the U.S. ties, the authoritarianism, cultural issues. What happened during the revolution itself, and what was the U.S. thinking?
Right, so the revolution had broad support initially, but two main organized factions emerged as contenders for power. Communists, often backed by the Soviets, and the religious fundamentalists led by Ayatollah Khomeini.
And the U.S. had to choose.
Well, facing the prospect of a potentially Soviet-aligned communist Iran right after losing the Shah, the U.S. made a calculation. They apparently decided the Islamists were the lesser of two evils, or perhaps easier to deal with eventually. Some argue the U.S. even tacitly supported or enabled the Islamist takeover to block the communists. Khomeini and the Islamists consolidated power, ruthlessly suppressed the communists and other opposition, and established the Islamic Republic. And of course, it became intensely anti-American, especially after the embassy hostage crisis.
A major miscalculation, or at least an outcome with severe blowback for the U.S.
You could certainly argue that.
This leads almost directly into the Iran-Iraq War, doesn't it? How did that start, and what was the U.S. role?
Yes, shortly after the Iranian Revolution, Saddam Hussein, who had recently consolidated power in Iraq, invaded Iran in 1980.
Why?
The official pretext involved border disputes and the Arab population in Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province. But the context is key. The U.S., reeling from the revolution and hostage crisis, saw Iran as weakened and hostile. Evidence suggests the U.S., perhaps wanting revenge or to contain the revolution, gave Saddam Hussein intelligence, possibly encouraged him, maybe even gave him a green light, thinking Iran's military would collapse quickly.
But it didn't.
Not at all. It turned into a brutal, devastating 8-year war. Huge casualties on both sides, trench warfare, chemical weapons used by Iraq, and in the end, almost no territorial change, just immense destruction.
Another catastrophic conflict. And the fallout from that war leads to the next one. The Gulf War in 1990-91.
There's a direct link. Both Iran and Iraq were economically shattered after their war. OPEC agreed to cut oil production to help prices recover, which both countries desperately needed.
But Kuwait didn't play along.
According to Iraq, Kuwait exceeded its OPEC quota, driving prices down. And worse, Iraq accused Kuwait of slant drilling, basically stealing oil from Iraqi fields across the border. This cost Iraq billions.
So Saddam felt wronged.
Deeply. He tried diplomacy but felt ignored. Then there was a now famous meeting with the U.S. ambassador, April Glaspie. Saddam apparently came away believing the U.S. wouldn't intervene if he took action against Kuwait, perhaps interpreting her comments as a green light, especially given Iraq's historical claims over Kuwait.
So he invaded Kuwait.
He did, in August 1990. The U.S. reaction under President George H.W. Bush was swift and decisive. They built a massive international coalition, launched Operation Desert Shield to protect Saudi Arabia, and then Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait.
Which they did.
Yes, Kuwait was liberated fairly quickly. But the air campaign against Iraq itself was massive, destroying infrastructure far beyond what seemed necessary just to free Kuwait. Critics questioned the scale of the bombing and the long-term objectives.
And this led to years of sanctions and inspections.
Exactly. After the war, the UN imposed strict sanctions, demanding Iraq eliminate all its weapons of mass destruction, WMDs.
Did they comply?
Iraq claims it destroyed its chemical weapons stockpiles in 1991 under UN supervision. Weapons inspectors, like Scott Ritter, worked for years. Ritter later claimed that by 1998, they accounted for something like 98% of Iraq's declared WMD capabilities, basically verifying they've been destroyed or dismantled.
But the U.S. wasn't satisfied.
Well, the inspectors were withdrawn in 1998, just before the U.S. and U.K. launched bombing raids Operation Desert Fox. Some link this timing to the Monica Lewinsky scandal involving President Clinton, a potential wag the dog scenario.
Politics influencing military action.
It's been suggested. Then, after 9/11, the Bush administration ramped up pressure again. Inspectors went back in 2002 under threat of invasion.
Despite the previous findings.
Despite Ritter and others saying there was likely nothing significant left. The justification for the 2003 invasion remained Iraq's supposed WMDs and alleged links to al-Qaeda, neither of which turned out to be true.
Were there other agendas? People talk about the Project for the New American Century.
Right, PNAC. This was a neoconservative group whose members later held key positions in the Bush administration. They had openly advocated for regime change in Iraq even before 9/11, seeing it as a step towards reshaping the entire Middle East, potentially targeting Syria, Iran, maybe even allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, eventually to align with U.S. interests and ensure dominance.
A grand strategy.
A very ambitious and ultimately disastrous one. The 2003 invasion led to chaos, insurgency, immense Iraqi casualties, and ultimately a U.S. withdrawal without achieving those grand aims.
Looking at the devastation in Iraq and more recently in places like Gaza, are there parallels in how these conflicts have been waged, particularly regarding U.S. influence or tactics?
Some observers draw parallels, particularly in the heavy reliance on air power and the resulting scale of civilian casualties and destruction. The bombing campaigns in Iraq and Israeli operations in Gaza and Lebanon have all involved overwhelming firepower.
But there are differences, too.
A key difference often highlighted is the underlying context. While the U.S. invasion of Iraq, despite its catastrophic consequences and unintended ethnic cleansing, wasn't explicitly framed as a project to permanently displace the population and settle the land. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, however, is widely understood within the framework of settler colonialism, involving ongoing displacement and land appropriation.
The scale of casualties is horrifying in both cases.
Staggering. Estimates for Iraqi deaths due to the war and its aftermath range up to 1.3, maybe even 2 million. In Gaza, the numbers killed just in the recent conflict were already exceeding 45,000, according to the source material we reviewed, with many more injured or missing. These raise serious questions about potential war crimes and crimes against humanity.
And the reaction in the West.
Generally, there hasn't been the same level of sustained public outrage or political pressure in Europe or the U.S. compared to, say, the reaction to the war in Ukraine, although there are significant exceptions, including among some Jewish American groups critical of Israeli policies. The impact on the Arab world itself has been devastating. A huge percentage of Arab states have been embroiled in conflict or instability, and Arabs constitute a massive proportion of the world's refugees.
It's a bleak picture after 76 years of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and a century of this kind of intervention. What about recent efforts like the Abraham Accords?
The Abraham Accords aim to normalize relations between Israel and some Arab states, bypassing the Palestinian issue. But the ongoing violence, especially in Gaza, has shown that normalization can't really succeed or be stable, while the core conflict remains unresolved and Palestinians face continued occupation and violence.
So looking forward, what's the potential path? The historian we consulted rejected the two-state solution.
Yes, arguing it's become practically impossible on the ground. They expressed hope, perhaps long-term, for a single secular state solution, one state for both Palestinians and Israelis with equal rights, safety, and democratic governance for everyone. Maybe something analogous to South Africa's transition, perhaps involving a truth and reconciliation process. It's a difficult path, but presented as potentially the only just and sustainable one left.
A challenging, but perhaps necessary vision. Professor, this has been incredibly enlightening. Thank you for walking us through this really complex and often troubling history.
You're very welcome. It's crucial history to understand.
Absolutely. We've covered so much ground, trying to piece together the forces that have shaped the Middle East through the lens of U.S. involvement. For you, our listeners, something to reflect on. Considering everything we've discussed, what does this history tell us about the impact of external powers? And, maybe more importantly, what could a genuinely constructive role look like going forward, if any is possible? Definitely food for thought. Thank you again for tuning into this deep dive. If you found this valuable, please do like this video and subscribe to the Curious Minds YouTube channel for more explorations like this one. We'll see you next time.